Rise of the European Emperor by Taishan Laonyo.
Chapter 701, Killing his wife to prove his spirit. After roaring for a long time, Henry VII asked with a gloomy face. "Are all your words true?" Weber looked scared, but still straightened his chest and said, "We will know the result at midnight." Henry VII nodded and ordered with a gloomy face. "Okay, you go down first. Richard, don't go back tonight." Richard Bull's face froze, but he nodded helplessly. He knew that Henry VII meant that he was afraid that he would inform Margaret. However, Richard Bull was a die-hard loyalist of Henry VII, and his loyalty to Henry VII was greater than his feelings for Margaret. In fact, Princess Margaret never looked down on Richard Bull. After all, Margaret was a princess from the York dynasty, and Richard Bull was just a follower of Henry VII, and his title was only a knight. But no matter what, Margaret is also his mother, and the mother of 5 children. Even if there is no emotion, he can't bear it for the other party to give birth to 5 children for him. However, Henry VII's order is not to be underestimated, and he is also a die-hard fan of Henry VII. So, Richard Bull finally sighed and went to the room arranged by Henry VII to rest. After Richard Bull left, Henry VII immediately arranged elite troops to ambush near the East Gate. Weber did not provide the hiding place of the ambush, which was deliberately arranged by Marin. If Henry VII's army found the small courtyard where the ambush troops were early, the effect would not be as intuitive and fierce as letting his men witness the rebellion of Margaret's men with their own eyes. If it was not exciting enough, Henry VII might not kill Margaret. If Marin's army was still alive when he entered London, it would be difficult to deal with. Therefore, Weber deliberately only said that they would seize the city gate in the middle of the night, but he didn't know more specific details. And this is also very convincing. After all, knowing everything makes people a little unbelievable. At about 11 o'clock in the middle of the night, the back door of the Bull mansion suddenly opened. 2 of Princess Margaret's trusted servants quietly slipped out of the back door and shuttled through the alley to the East Gate and the West Gate respectively. However, what he didn't know was that his whereabouts had long been monitored by Henry VII's men. "Humph, did you really take action?" Henry VII sneered after receiving the news. Princess Margaret's confidant went out not to notify those people to take action, but to observe the situation. These 2 people did not join the 2 groups that attacked the city gate, but would hide in the dark and observe the results. If they captured the city gate, they would naturally rely on their familiarity with the terrain of the city and quickly rush back to the mansion to inform Princess Margaret. Conversely, if they failed, they would also notify Princess Margaret so that they could make plans early. If the person in charge of seizing the gate of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce in the West Gate knew about it, he would definitely break out in a cold sweat. Because, if the people who came to the West Gate came directly, they would definitely be killed. Fortunately, the 2 of them only went to the city gate to observe the battle situation, not to contact directly. Otherwise, they would definitely be killed. After 12 o'clock in the middle of the night, about 100 strong men holding swords and shields came out one after another from an inconspicuous small courtyard near the East Gate of London City. Before entering East Street, the leader also popped his head out and looked left and right for a long time. After finding that there was no problem, he took his men to the street. After approaching the East Gate within 100 meters, the leader shouted, "Go," and then more than 100 people rushed to the gate of the East Gate. But at this time, suddenly from the alleys on the north and south sides of the East Gate, thousands of soldiers and horses came out one after another. Moreover, they were all regular soldiers wearing armor. You know, there were only 2,000 or 3,000 regular soldiers in the entire city of London at this time. Sending out thousands of regular soldiers really looked down on them. The leader was sweating profusely and what's going on? How could there be thousands of regular soldiers to surround them? But at this time, they had no way to retreat, so they had to grit their teeth and continue to rush to the city gate. Unfortunately, their number was too small. Facing an enemy 10 times their number, even if they risked their lives, it would be useless. The people recruited by Princess Margaret were all desperate criminals from England. They might have good personal martial arts and might be able to defeat a regular soldier in a one-on-one duel. However, group battles were never their forte. If they relied on sneak attacks and rushed into the city gate, the hundreds of British soldiers guarding the city gate would probably not be able to escape defeat. After all, they had the upper hand, and the defenders were defenseless. However, facing thousands of regular soldiers wearing armor, these people were also helpless. To put it bluntly, they had no armor on them, only a wooden shield and a one-handed knife. If they threw away the wooden shield and made the one-handed knife shorter, they would be a group of gangsters. At most, they were just a group of red stick thugs among gangsters. It was amazing, there were more than 100 Chinhanans. However, what stood in front of them at this moment were thousands of regular soldiers wearing armor, many of whom were palace guards with strong martial arts skills. With such a huge gap in strength, this group of gangsters was quickly wiped out. At the same time, the people sent by Princess Margaret to observe the situation were also quietly captured by the English royal spies who followed them. But fortunately, the servant sent to the West Gate seemed to have a very strong temperament. After being surrounded, he drew his sword and fought desperately, and was eventually killed on the spot. At the same time, with his death, the secret of the West Gate was preserved. Moreover, the fight caused by this arrest happened near the small courtyard rented by the people of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce. Well, the people in the courtyard didn't dare to go out even without the North Sea Chamber of Commerce making excuses. Obviously, going out at this time was equivalent to seeking death. After dealing with the more than 100 gangsters who attacked the East Gate, the army quickly surrounded Richard Bull's residence. Soon, Princess Margaret was brought out with an unwilling look on her face and escorted to the palace. Princess Margaret was full of resentment and unwillingness at this time. She never expected that when her brother was about to capture London, her men actually failed and she was captured. It was so unlucky. When she met Henry VII, Princess Margaret's face was still full of indignation. Henry VII shouted at Princess Margaret with anger on his face. "How have I wronged you? I didn't kill you. I made you a countess and found you a good husband. Why are you still making trouble? Isn't it better to live a peaceful life? Why do you have to rebel?" Princess Margaret knew that she was finished, and she responded unwillingly. "I rebel. It's you who rebelled, right? You killed the king with the support of a group of traitors and usurped the throne. You are just a tyrant. What qualifications do you have to be king? You must know that His Majesty Henry IV has long deprived your line of inheritance. You are not qualified to be king at all. Asshole, I became the Lord of England by following the will of heaven." Henry VII said angrily. "What you call following the will of heaven is to kill the king and establish yourself, right? Tyrant." Princess Margaret fought back without showing any weakness. "I am not the regicide, Richard III is the regicide. I eliminated Richard III, the real regicide, to avenge His Majesty Edward V. Henry VII defended. "Where's the evidence? You don't even have any evidence, and you still have the nerve to say that Richard III killed the king? It's been 20 years, and you don't have any evidence. How can you prove your words? Therefore, you are the real regicide, a robber, a tyrant, a despicable and shameless villain." This just hit Henry VII's sore spot. He really couldn't produce any effective evidence to prove that Richard III killed the king. So, in a rage, he directly called Richard Pole. "Richard, handle it yourself. Don't worry, her title of Earl of Salisbury will be passed on to your eldest son Henry." Henry VII said with a gloomy face. Richard Pole's son was named Henry Pole, and even his name was the same as his master, which shows that Richard Pole was really a good and loyal dog. After struggling for a long time, Richard Pole said to Henry VII. "Your Majesty, please give me a cup of poisoned wine. In addition, please do not tell the public that Margaret was killed in rebellion, just say that she died accidentally." After saying that, he knelt in front of Henry VII. Henry VII thought about it and decided to give his confidant a face. "Okay, I will announce to the public that Margaret died of a sudden illness." Soon, Henry VII's men brought the poisoned wine. Richard Pole handed the wine glass to Margaret with a bitter face and said, "Drink it, so that you can at least keep your body intact." In order to show his loyalty to Henry VII, he also killed his wife to prove his loyalty. Chapter 702, Shemin Po. Looking at the poisoned wine handed over by her husband Richard Bull, Princess Margaret said with disdain. "You are really my good husband, handing me the poisoned wine with your own hands. Wouldn't it be better to kill the tyrant Henry and surrender to my brother? You know, my brother promised to make our children the Duke." "Don't say it, your brother won't succeed," Richard Bull said firmly. Well, I can't persuade you, the loyal dog of Henry the thief. However, if you hand me the poisoned wine now, my brother will not let you go when the city slopes. I just hope that you can take good care of our children. Those children are my children after all, and my brother will never treat them badly. His Majesty Henry will not treat them badly either. Richard Bowles said unmoved. He knew that his master was suspicious and it was best to behave properly. Okay, please put me in the coffin as soon as possible. Children, goodbye. After saying that, Princess Margaret calmly took the poisoned wine cup and drank it all. Not long after, Princess Margaret died of poison. Wait. I suddenly remembered that she sent someone to the West Gate to watch before. What happened? Henry VII remembered something and hurried over. But when he arrived, Princess Margaret had already died of poison. What does it mean that she sent someone to the West Gate to watch? Henry VII thought with some distress. However, Princess Margaret was already dead at this time, and the attendant sent to the West Gate to observe also died on the spot. So, no one knew the inside story. The cautious Henry VII sent troops to guard the West Gate for a night, but there was nothing unusual, so he had to give up. Maybe, that was a trick. Henry VII thought. However, for safety reasons, Henry VII still sent a large group of people to ambush the West Gate at midnight the next day. But until 3 o'clock in the morning, there was no movement inside the West Gate. So, Henry VII's men had to go back with their men in disappointment. It was not until after 4 o'clock in the morning that more than 100 people came out of a small courtyard inside the West Gate. It's a good thing they withdrew, otherwise, it would be inconvenient to do it. Kane and Robbie, the leading spies of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce, said after a sigh of relief. Before, their spies had been scouting on the roof, and only after seeing the British army leave did they issue a safety alarm. In fact, in Marin's army, night raids are never in the middle of the night, but around 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. According to Marin, this is when the enemy is most trapped and their defenses are most lax. If it were winter, it would not be too late to launch a raid after 5 o'clock. But now it's summer, and it's light at 4:30. Therefore, a night attack around 4 o'clock is the most appropriate. After more than 100 people in the yard put on wooden armor and took their swords and shields, Kane took out a Kongming lantern and lit it up to the sky. This was the agreed signal to break the door. It was inconvenient to make a sound in the middle of the night, so it was more appropriate to raise a small Kongming lantern to the sky. Soon, the scouts under Marin's command outside the city also saw the small Kongming lantern through a telescope and reported to Marin, who had been waiting on the side, "Grand Duke, the people in the city are ready." "Very good, everyone is ready to enter the city. The cavalry are all on horseback, and the rest of the people must follow." After that, the army began to slowly approach the West Gate of London, but was more careful to avoid alarming the enemy. In the city, Kane and Robbie, after taking more than 100 people out of the yard, walked onto the street and rushed to the city gate of the West Gate. At the same time, Kane also brought a gunpowder barrel. After arriving near the West Gate, a person suddenly jumped out of the alley on the side, scaring everyone. But Kane and Robbie seemed to know the situation and asked calmly, "What's the situation?" "Don't worry, there are no enemies around, only more than 100 people in the city gate and enemies on the top of the city wall." "That's good." Kane and Robbie nodded, then waved to their subordinates, signaling everyone to follow. After approaching the West Gate, Kane drew his knife and whispered, "Go." After that, everyone rushed forward. The more than 100 guards in the city gate were actually unlucky, because Margaret's spies appeared near the West Gate last night. At around 12 o'clock tonight, they actually didn't sleep, just to prevent someone from raiding. But after 12 o'clock, no one came to raid. After 3 o'clock, it seemed that there was no danger. The army that assisted in guarding the gate left, and the guards in the city gate also fell asleep. After all, they were really tired after not sleeping in the middle of the night. Unexpectedly, just after they fell asleep for a while, Kane and Robbie led people to rush into the city gate. When more than 100 people rushed into the city gate, most of the guards in the city gate were asleep and could not be awakened. Enemy attack. The awake British soldiers shouted. But unfortunately, he had just finished shouting, and his comrades had not woken up yet, and the enemy had already rushed in. In desperation, the awakened handsome soldiers had to fight in a hurry. Because they had fallen asleep, many people did not put their swords with them and needed to get up to find them. In the chaos, the handsome soldiers in the city gate were in chaos. Not long after, they were defeated by the rabble of spies from the North Sea Chamber of Commerce and the desperate criminals hired by Princess Margaret. But at this time, Cain and Robbie were also dumbfounded. Because, they saw that behind the gate in the city gate, there were a lot of debris piled up. Because he was afraid that someone would attack the west gate, Henry VII specially piled up a lot of things in the west gate to block the city gate. Although it was not as bad as the situation of blocking the city gate at the north gate, it did make Cain and Robbie feel difficult. Although Cain and Robbie's 100 men could clean up these things quickly, the problem was that the British army would not give them too much time. The handsome man on the top of the city wall had been alarmed and was organizing the army to go down the city wall. If they did not clean up the debris in the city gate as soon as possible, they would not be able to open the city gate. Fortunately, Cain brought a gunpowder barrel. So Cain gritted his teeth and said, "Everyone, retreat from the city gate and block the stairs coming down from the city wall. I will blow up the door." After that, everyone retreated from the city gate to resist the British army rushing down from the city wall. They had shields, and sword and shield soldiers were most suitable for defense. When there was no one in the city gate, Cain dug up the bricks and stones blocking the city gate and buried the gunpowder barrel in it. Then, he dragged out the fuse, picked up a sheep oil lamp in the city gate, and lit the fuse. After lighting it, Cain immediately threw away the sheep oil lamp, and ran out of the city gate without looking back. Boom! After a loud bang, the things piled up in the city gate were really blown apart, and no longer piled up behind the city gate. But the problem is the door was not blown up. Cain saw that it was not good, and hurriedly shouted, "Come on, a few people, follow me to open the city gate." Then, under Cain's leadership, several spies from the North Sea Chamber of Commerce ran into the city gate. Several people worked together to pry open the iron bolt of the city gate. This thing was stuck after the explosion. Then, they tried their best to clean up the scattered bricks and stones next to the city gate, and slowly opened the west gate of London. "Quick, the city gate is open. Rush in." At this time, more than 100 cavalrymen rushed over first. But unfortunately, because the gunpowder barrel exploded inside the city gate hole is now a mess. This also led to Cain, Robbie and others trying their best to open the city gate, but it was only a big gap that allowed people to pass through, but not horses. If you want to open the city gate, you have to continue to clean up the scattered bricks and stones in the city gate hole. Seeing this situation, Con, who led the charge, made a prompt decision and turned back to order. "Everyone get off the horse, walk into the city gate, and be sure to guard the city gate hole." After that, Con got off the horse first, holding a mace, and got into the city gate hole. The other more than 100 cavalrymen also dismounted, threw away their lances, drew their knightly swords, and followed Con into the chaotic gate of the west gate of London City. Chapter 703, Siege of the Tower of London. What's that noise? In the early hours of the morning, Henry VII, who was sleeping soundly, suddenly heard a loud noise from the west and woke up immediately. He had been under a lot of pressure these days and his sleep was very shallow. In addition, the palace was located in the western part of the city, so he was naturally awakened by the loud noise from the west gate. When the attendant heard Henry VII's question, he immediately went out to inquire about the news. Not long after, the attendant came in a panic. "Your Majesty! Your Majesty! Something bad has happened." Because of the tension and panting, the attendant couldn't speak clearly. "What's wrong?" Henry VII suddenly had a bad feeling. The west gate was breached, the enemy blew it up with gunpowder and is pouring in. The attendant took a breath and spoke very quickly. "What?" Henry VII was shocked and jumped out of bed immediately. "Tell me what happened." "It seems that a group of bandits in the city used gunpowder barrels to blow up the piles in the city gate hole and opened the west gate. It's over." Henry VII fell to the head of the bed. At this time, the battle at the west gate of London was also extremely fierce. After all, those handsome warriors who were responsible for blocking the city wall were just some gangsters. It would be difficult for them to hold out for a long time if the enemy was organized and prepared. Sure enough, not long after Con rushed into the city gate, the handsome gangsters who were blocking the city wall retreated into the city gate. What a waste! Con cursed in a low voice in German with disdain. However, he also knew that these people had made great contributions to opening the city gate, and he could not ask for more. Without the obstruction of those English gangsters, the British soldiers on the top of the city rushed to the city gate like a tide, trying to drive Khan and others out and close the city gate. But who is Khan? A humanoid devil. Khan swung a heavy mace full of spikes and smashed it hard. All the British soldiers who approached the city gate were either smashed away or smashed into meat patties. The scene was extremely bloody. Damn it, this guy is too fierce. The British commander was furious. After thinking for a while, the British commander ordered loudly, "Longbowmen, shoot this bastard to death." So, a group of English longbowmen drew their bows and aimed at Khan. With the order of the British commander, feather arrows immediately poured down like rain on Khan and the East Frisian knights beside him. If these people were wearing ordinary cast iron plate armor popular in this era, they might be shot through by the powerful English longbows at such a close distance. However, Marin's most elite men were all wearing high-carbon steel plate armor, which was extremely strong. Many people's breastplates were even made of rare high-manganese steel. And the perverted Khan was wearing high-manganese steel all over his body. Because high-manganese steel is difficult to make, it needs to be formed in one go, which makes processing extremely difficult. This full set of high-manganese steel plate armor is only available to a few high-level generals such as Marin, Schwartz, and Khan. Even the heavy cavalry of the 1st Legion, which was sent out by Marin's trusted confidants, only used high-manganese steel for breastplates and helmets. Breastplates and helmets are easier to form. Facing the steel plate armor, even a powerful bow like the English longbow was powerless. As time went by, the dead soldiers who pushed into the city gate, although they were not good at fighting, quickly helped to clean up the debris and completely opened the city gate. At this time, the main force of Marin's army finally rushed to the west gate. Seeing that the infantry had rushed up and were behind him, Khan knew that his task had changed from guarding the city gate to leading the charge. "Charge!" Khan shouted, and then waved his mace and rushed towards the English longbowmen. The other plate armor knights of the 1st Legion also shouted loudly in response. This torrent of steel quickly dispersed the English longbowmen. Even many longbowmen who did not have time to evacuate were directly smashed by Khan's wild bull with a mace. The mace smashed down, blood and flesh flew everywhere, and the spikes on the stick were still hanging with a lot of bloody pieces of meat. Seeing this horrible scene in front of them, many British soldiers collapsed. Especially those sailors who were called upon. When had they ever seen such a fierce man as Khan? So, many frightened sailors immediately threw away their sailor scimitars and shouted, "Oh my God, this must be the devil." Then, many sailors fled in all directions. "It's over." Locke, the commander of the British army stationed at the west gate, saw this scene in front of him and knew that the situation was over, and he sat down helplessly on the ground. Then, a strange scene appeared on the streets of London. A tough man wielding a mace was chasing a group of sailors with knives. When Henry VII took out the 300 plate armor knights who were the palace guards as a trump card, intending to drive out the enemy and take back the west gate, he encountered huge troubles. Their way was blocked by those fleeing sailors. The plate armor knights lost their speed, which was equivalent to heavy armored infantry. Khan was also shocked. If these 300 English guards knights rushed on the street, he, a fierce general, would also be knocked away. But now it was different. With those hundreds of English sailors blocking the road, those English guards knights had to stop. In this way, they could not charge. Taking this opportunity, Khan waved his mace, drove the sailors, and continued to attack the English guards cavalry. But at this time, Khan did not continue to charge. After all, there were 300 plate armored knights on the opposite side. These knights were all ruthless people who had practiced martial arts since childhood. Although Khan was fierce, he could beat 7 or 8 people alone, but facing 300 people, he would kneel. After following Marin for a long time, Khan also became a mischievous person and refused to suffer losses. He knew that there was a troop behind that specialized in fighting knights, the Scout Cavalry. This time, Marin sent out the only 100 East Frisian Guards Knights of the 1st Legion to attack the West Gate. In addition, there were 200 Scout Cavalry accompanying. As for the other 300 Scout Cavalry, they actually went to monitor the East Gate and the South Gate. As for why they brought these 200 Scout Cavalry, it was because they had horses. It was convenient for them to rush in quickly with the Plate Knights when the city gate was opened. But Khan knew, they were still carrying guns. Seeing more than 100 Plate Knights coming up from behind, Khan turned his head and saw the 200 Scout Cavalry following the Plate Knights. They were all light cavalry, but they all carried at least 2 clockwork flintlocks. Gunners in the back. Come up and shoot the English knights on the opposite side. Conn shouted. Understood. Mackensen, the head of the Scout Cavalry Regiment, responded loudly. He also saw the 300 English knights across the street and knew that the clockwork flintlocks in his hands were their nemesis. Brothers of the Guard Knights in front, lend me your shoulders. Mackensen shouted. What he meant was that he wanted those Guard Knights to be human benches, and let the Scout Cavalry stand on their shoulders and shoot. Their horses were left outside the city gate before. If you want to hit those English Guard Knights, you can only stand higher and shoot. No problem. Conn gave an order, and the East Frisian Guards Knights immediately acted as human benches, holding hands, allowing the reconnaissance cavalry to stand on their shoulders and helping to support them. Then, separated by hundreds of sailors, the Scout Cavalry stood on the shoulders of the Guards Knights and aimed at the English Guards Knights on the opposite side. Not good, retreat quickly. The captain of the English Guards Knights who led the way saw that it was not good and immediately wanted to turn around and run away. However, the street was now crowded with too many people, and the knight captain couldn't even rein in his horse and turn around. Then, he became the first unlucky knight to be knocked off his horse. The enemy is firing muskets again, retreat quickly. The knights panicked. But at this time, they were crowded with people and horses, and it was difficult to retreat. They were crowded together and several of them were knocked off their horses. At this time, a knight captain finally made the right choice. He shouted. The rear team becomes the front team, turn around first, and retreat. Then, the people behind retreated first, and the knights in front had the opportunity to turn around and run away. Seeing that the Guards Knights who were blocking the road in front ran away, the English sailors who were originally blocked continued to run away. And Conn did not chase them, but led everyone back to the city gate to get the horses. He was not tired after fighting on foot for a while, but some other knights began to gasp for breath. After all, wearing dozens of kilograms of plate armor, walking is indeed very physically demanding. Moreover, fighting on foot is also very inconvenient. But before leaving, Conn asked the infantry spear team to come over and block the street to prevent the British guards from coming back. After Conn returned to the street with the guards and scout cavalry of the 1st Legion, he took the lead and rushed to the palace. Soon, the army surrounded the Tower of London. The 300 English guards, now less than 300, retreated into the Tower of London, intending to defend it to the death. Chapter 704, The Capture of Henry VII. The Tower of London is a fortress-type solid building, an independent castle in the city. Because it is the residence of the royal family of all dynasties, it is extremely heavily guarded and the walls are very tall and solid. It seems that it is not easy to guard this solid castle with more than 200 highly skilled guards and hundreds of regular soldiers. Conn led the team to the main gate of the Tower of London Palace, the southwest gate, waiting for the arrival of the demolition team. Neither Marin nor Edward entered the city, but supervised the battle outside the city. Of course, in fact, these two guys did not enter the city immediately because they were afraid of death. According to the two people's plan, they must wait until the enemy is eliminated before they will wear plate armor and hold an entry ceremony, and accept the cheers of their subjects in a pretentious manner. What? You said that the citizens of London are unwilling to cheer. What are the swords of the soldiers under their command for? If they don't cheer, they will be beaten. The city of London is too large, with tens of thousands of residents. In this era, it is definitely a big city. The city is full of streets and dark alleys. Marin was very worried that he would be assassinated by the enemy without the escort of the elite after entering the city. You know, in order to attack, he sent out his top bodyguard Conn and a group of guards knights. It seems difficult to stop the assassination by relying on the group of infantry around him. After all, those muscular knights, wearing plate armor, are very durable and suitable to be their own meat shields. Looking at the west gate of London and the surging Thames in the south, Marin was silent for a long time, and suddenly asked. By the way, I remember that the Tower of London is by the Thames, and the southeast wall of this palace faces the Thames. By the way, will Henry VII escape from the Thames? Edward was stunned, then slapped his head and said. It's really possible. Should we send someone to intercept? Have you made any preparations? Speaking of which, Marin really neglected this point. After all, he is not an intelligent computer, and it is inevitable that there will be loopholes in his thinking. McKinley, one of the leaders of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce, said with a smile. Don't worry, Grand Duke. The 10 merchant ships of our North Sea Chamber of Commerce in the port of London are probably out now. They are probably blocking the small royal dock outside the southeast gate of the Tower of London. Oh, you are really capable. You have thought of this. If you catch a big fish, I will reward you. Yes, a big reward. I am not a stingy person. Edward also said on the side. Sure enough, McKinley did not lie. At this time, the 10 large ships of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce blocked the royal dock on the surface of the Thames River outside the southeast gate of the Tower of London. At this time, Henry VII was so angry that he jumped up and down. Assholes. Where did these assholes come from? Why are they blocking our escape ship? In fact, Henry VII did have a big ship of about 200 tons at the royal dock. Originally, after learning that Marin's army had entered the city of London, Henry VII had made plans to take his wife and children on board the ship and go to sea, and then go into exile abroad. Anyway, it's not like Henry VII hasn't been in exile before. Back then, as a member of the Lancaster family, he stayed in the Duchy of Brittany for a long time to avoid being hunted down by the York family. He had already made plans, take his wife, children, and some confidants, carry some precious jewels, and go into exile in the Netherlands to seek the asylum of Emperor Maximilian I. As for France, he couldn't go. He had previously commanded the English navy to destroy the French navy, and Louis XII wanted to chop him off. And Spain, because of the death of Princess Catherine, would not have a good impression of him. Only Maximilian I, who had no grudges against him, was easier to accept. Moreover, Maximilian I was Marin Hoffman's boss anyway, and he could always stop the evil dog from hunting him down. If the Netherlands didn't take him in, he would go into exile in Norway. But plans were just plans after all. When Henry VII packed up and prepared to take his family and confidants on board, he unexpectedly discovered that the river was blocked. Henry VII was so angry that he jumped up and down, but soon he realized that he couldn't escape. After Con waited for the demolition team to arrive, he ordered the demolition team's demolitionists to use iron pickaxes to pry open the bricks and stones under the gate of the Tower of London, bury the gunpowder barrels inside, and then ignite them. Boom, the southwest gate of the Tower of London was blown open. Con, with a mixed formation of guards knights and scout cavalry musketeers, carefully broke into the Tower of London Palace. But what surprised Con was that the resistance along the way was not very strong, and most of them were blocked by some infantry. In front of the guards knights, these infantrymen were just serving food. But soon, Con understood why the enemy's resistance was not strong. It turned out that Henry VII took his family and his trusted guards knights and ran to the southeast gate facing the Thames. It seems that he wants to take a boat to escape. No, we can't let this guy escape, let's stop them. Con was shocked. But soon, he was no longer nervous. Because he saw the merchant ship of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce with a black cross flag raised on the river, obviously, Henry VII's ship was blocked. I will give you all the money and make you nobles, get out of the way. Henry VII shouted on the shore. However, the captains of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce were unmoved. What a joke, I know you have a lot of money, but who dares to take your money in public? As for making us nobles, you yourself are in danger, who will recognize the nobility? In the end, Henry VII decided to fight to the death. He boarded the warship with more than 200 guards knights and their families. Then, let the guard knights who knew how to sail control the ship and rush to the merchant ships of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce that blocked them. But the situation did not develop as Henry VII expected. The 200 guard knights could fight 10 on land. But on the deck of the ship, they were much worse than the sailors who made up the numbers in the city. When jumping off the boat to fight to the death, many guard knights fell down directly. In fact, a few did not jump directly to the opposite ship, but fell directly into the river. Although these English guard knights are also good at water, it does not mean that they are good at fighting on the ship. Soon, on the shaking deck, the brave English guard knights were defeated. In particular, the sailors of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce took out the clockwork flintlock, a knight's nemesis. In the end, Henry VII's family failed to escape by boat. When Con boarded the ship with a large group of people and chased to the river, Henry VII's family could only be captured. Henry VII was very dissatisfied and cursed. Con was furious and knocked Henry VII unconscious with a knife. Then, he carried the unconscious Henry VII off the boat like a chicken and returned to the Tower of London, which was controlled by the army of the Grand Duchy of the North Sea. Chapter 7053 Rules. In fact, the most capable fighters in London were Henry VII's 300 Guards Knights. But unfortunately, when Henry VII fled with his family by water, he used the remaining 200 Guards Knights as sailors, and they were defeated by the sailors of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce, who had much lower combat effectiveness. These Guards Knights were not weak in combat power, but they could not stand steadily on the swaying deck of the ship. What does it mean to fight with an unstable lower body? It means falling, and then being captured or killed. If these 200 Guards Knights defended the Tower of London, they would probably be able to hold on for a long time. Even a fierce man like Con would find it difficult to break through such a large group of England's best Guards Knights. However, they were on the ship, and then they all fell. About 260 knights, more than 60 were killed on the spot, and more than 190 were defeated and captured. In addition to the most elite 300 Guards Knights, there were 2,700 regular infantry. Unfortunately, Henry VII scattered them at the four gates to supervise the sailors and failed to gather them together. When the Tower of London was breached, these scattered infantrymen had no need to resist. And those more irregular sailors were even more unwilling to continue fighting when the king was captured. When they heard that the Tower of London had been breached, most of the defenders laid down their weapons and surrendered, except for Richard Pole. Richard Pole guarded the East Gate with 700 regular infantrymen and a large number of sailors. When he learned that the Tower of London had been breached, his men lost their fighting spirit. Only he continued to resist with hundreds of trusted soldiers. Unfortunately, the East Gate was also blocked from the inside, and Richard Pole did not even have a chance to escape. When Con arrived with Marin's guards, some things were doomed. Richard Pole was knocked unconscious and carried away. Then, the whole city of London quieted down, with only sporadic resistance. What? This guy handed the poisoned wine to my sister personally. When Edward heard the captive say this, he exploded. I'm going to kill this bastard. My sister is his wife, and he actually sent my sister to death with his own hands. After that, Edward drew his sword and was about to go to the temporary prison to kill Richard Pole. Marin hurriedly hugged Edward. Your Majesty, you are the master of the Kingdom of England now, you can't be impulsive. But, that guy killed my sister. That's my only brother or sister, and the sister who saved my life. Woo-woo, Edward thought of sacrificing his life to save his sister, and couldn't help crying sadly. After crying for a while, Edward suddenly said with a fierce look on his face. I'm going to kill Richard, the bastard. And, that snitch Weber. By the way, where is the snitch Weber? Edward asked, holding the sword. Marin shook his head, and so did everyone else. In fact, Weber had already fled to the ship of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce at the seaside under the cover of Marin's men. One of Marin's guards covered Weber's departure. The guard changed Weber into a soldier's uniform and a hat from Marin's army, and took him to the dock and boarded the ship of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce. It was a mess at that time, and no one noticed. Asshole. He actually let that guy run away. Go search the area near the palace, and be sure to find this traitor. Edward roared. But it was in vain, because Marin had already sent someone to send Weber away by ship. Marin planned to send Weber to America and then change his name. If I can't catch Weber, then I'll kill Richard and Henry. Edward said angrily. Your Majesty. Marin shouted. You are now the real king of a country, and you can't be willful anymore. There are laws in the country. If you want to kill Henry and Richard, you must go through a trial before you can kill them. Trial? Why? Edward was puzzled. Marin said seriously. Only when there are laws in the country can the people feel at ease. If the people are uneasy, they may be instigated to rebel by those who are interested. Therefore, Your Majesty, you must establish laws to stabilize the society and support the people. Only when there are laws in the country can the people feel at ease. Edward repeated Marin's words and fell into deep thought. After a long time, Edward woke up and said gratefully. Grand Duke Marin, you said it very well, you are really a genius. This is not my idea, but what my teacher Einstein said. Marin said casually. In fact, this is just the interpretation of rule of law in later generations. Einstein is really a wise man. Edward said with reverence. In fact, this is not what my teacher Einstein came up with, but what he saw in the Eastern Empire. Marin decided to tell Edward a story. Eastern experience. Edward was a little curious. Yes, Your Majesty, let me tell you a story from more than 1,700 years ago. Please say. Edward knew that Marin was probably talking about how to govern the country. Moreover, he was also very interested in Master Einstein's Eastern experiences. The story I'm telling you is called Three Articles of Agreement. Then, Marin told Edward in detail the story of Emperor Gaozu of Han entering Xianyang and making the Three Articles of Agreement with the people of Guangzhou. Through the Three Articles of Agreement, Liu Bang, the first emperor of the Han Empire, quickly won the trust of the people of Guangzhou. Later, he established his capital in Guangzhou and relied on the army composed of local people to dominate the world and build a Han Empire that was larger than Western Europe. Edward was fascinated after hearing this. As a king, he was most interested in the stories of these great emperors in ancient times. Three Articles of Agreement. Those who kill will be killed, those who injure and steal will be punished. It's so simple. Is the effect really that good? Of course, Your Majesty regards the people as human beings and is willing to use the law to protect them, and they will be willing to be loyal to Your Majesty. There is a saying in the East, if the monarch regards his subjects as his own hands and feet, then his subjects will regard the monarch as their own heart and soul. If the monarch regards his subjects as dogs and horses, then his subjects will regard the monarch as their fellow countrymen. If the monarch regards his subjects as dirt, then his subjects will regard the monarch as their enemy. Although the Three Articles of Law are simple, they reflect that Your Majesty cherishes the lives of the people. They will be grateful and obey. If the monarch regards his subjects as his own hands and feet, then his subjects will regard the monarch as their own heart and soul. If the monarch regards his subjects as dogs and horses, then his subjects will regard the monarch as their fellow countrymen. If the monarch regards his subjects as dirt, then his subjects will regard the monarch as their enemy. Edward murmured to himself. After a long while, he said. Eastern culture is so profound. But. Edward suddenly changed the topic and said. How can I kill Henry and his lackeys? According to the current laws, there are no relevant provisions for executing them. Then revise the laws. However, before that, you need to make 3 agreements with the people to stabilize the society. Otherwise, if the unrest continues, you as the king will not be at peace. Okay, I will make 3 agreements with the people of London so that they can settle down sooner. Chapter 706, Bloodbath of Parliament, Standing as a Sign of Faith. Edward excitedly sent people to post notices in the streets and alleys, announcing the 3 Articles of the Law and ordering the army to strictly prohibit looting. However, in order to appease the army, Edward took out a lot of money from Henry VII's treasury to reward the soldiers. Edward was not a greedy and brainless person. At least, he knew that as long as he sat firmly on the throne, there would be plenty of money in the future. In particular, he decided to kill the great nobles who followed Henry VII and confiscate their wealth. Therefore, he would not be short of money. You know, the money in the homes of those great nobles may not be less than that in the treasury. What's more, those fiefdoms and manors are the real big heads. The soldiers got the reward money, so naturally they had no complaints. What's more, this army was mainly Marin's army. There was no tradition of looting, and there was no resistance to not allowing looting. The 3,000 German mercenaries hired from Munster before were very sorry that they could not rob in London. However, Marin did not let his men rob, and Edward did not let them rob. So, after receiving the reward, they didn't say anything. However, a few days later, what embarrassed Edward and Marin was that the citizens of London didn't seem to be very interested in the 3 Articles of the Constitution. In fact, this was also because Marin didn't have a deep understanding of British history. As early as 1215, the famous Magna Carta appeared in Britain, proposing the concept of legal system. Therefore, Edward's 3 Articles of the Constitution is actually not news. In addition, in the UK, general laws are promulgated through Parliament. Therefore, people are actually not very interested in Edward's private promulgation of laws. So, Marin and Edward were embarrassed. This. Your Majesty. It seems that this 3 Articles of the Constitution is a bit similar to the Magna Carta. Marin said embarrassedly. No, Grand Duke Marin, you are wrong. Edward said seriously. Strictly speaking, the Magna Carta is the product of the nobles forcing the king, which has swept the monarch's authority. Therefore, I must adhere to the 3 Articles of the Constitution and make people forget the Magna Carta and recognize the 3 Articles of the Constitution instead. Only in this way can my rule be stable. Marin was relieved. It seemed that Edward was still very sober. He knew that the Magna Carta was a challenge to the royal power. In fact, Henry VII and Henry VIII were both monarchs who held the royal power very tightly. In the 15th and 16th centuries, few people mentioned the Magna Carta. However, the tradition of the king issuing decrees through Parliament has been preserved. However, Edward has been in France and knows that France acts on the will of the monarch without restrictions, which makes him very envious. Therefore, Edward wants to take advantage of the opportunity of the 3 Articles of the Constitution to bypass Parliament, issue decrees on his own, and become an autocratic monarch, just like the King of France. Marin thought for a while and said, "If that's the case, then, Your Majesty, please give an order to arrest all the members of Parliament." "Arrest all the members of Parliament? Are you going to kill all the members of Parliament? What excuse will you use?" Edward said in surprise. "Excuses? Easy to find. Your Majesty, have you forgotten? When the false King Henry ascended the throne, the nobles welcomed Henry Tudor as the second Joshua, the Jewish king after Moses, who saved the people from the tyrant, and soon passed a decree announcing that the throne of England would be passed down from generation to generation by Henry Tudor and his descendants. What you mean is, there are 2 points. First, Henry Tudor was a regicide, but the members of the House of Lords supported him as king, which was tantamount to approving the regicide. This is enough to sentence those who participated in the death penalty. Second, Henry Tudor was a descendant of John Beaufort, Duke of Lancaster. But according to the order of His Majesty Henry IV, the descendants of John Beaufort have no right to inherit the throne at all. The announcement by the House of Lords of Parliament that the throne of England would be passed down from generation to generation by Henry Tudor and his descendants is a collective violation of the law. Therefore, Your Majesty can collectively arrest all members of the House of Lords. Moreover, you must issue a decree to publicly and legally massacre the Parliament." Marin said the last word. It is a rare opportunity to find a legal basis to bloodbath the Parliament, which must not be missed. Moreover, according to Edward's remarks just now, he also hopes to get rid of the control of the Parliament. Therefore, it is better to use their original support for Henry VII, the regicide, as an excuse to bloodbath the Parliament. Edward was very tempted, but he hesitated and asked, "Then, who will I rely on to govern the country in the future?" Marin thought about it, and suddenly remembered a method in the official novels of later generations: all those who were disliked and not reused by the predecessor, as long as there is no big problem, I will reuse them, and those who were liked by the predecessor were demoted. In this way, the situation can be controlled as quickly as possible and the traces of the predecessor can be erased. To be honest, this approach is quite unscientific. Because this is a very irresponsible approach, it is easy to cause change of orders every day, which is harmful to the stability of policies. However, it depends on where it is used. Edward now kills Henry VII to seize the throne, and uses the crude method of, "the enemy of my enemy is my friend," which is the fastest and easiest way to control the situation. So Marin explained to Edward. Edward naturally would not worry about whether the order would change overnight, he only worried about whether he could sit firmly on the throne. So, he did not hesitate to adopt Marin's suggestion. In this way, Edward ordered the army to arrest all illegal nobles on the one hand, and on the other hand, he sent people to inquire about those nobles who were not on good terms with Henry VII or were not valued. The Tower of London is really a good place, and successive kings have built a large number of prisons here. Therefore, it is completely enough to imprison the members of the House of Lords. Of course, this is also related to the fact that Henry VII also bloodbathed a large number of Yorkist nobles. Therefore, there are only dozens of members arrested this time. Moreover, among them, there are 10 members of the House of Lords who immediately please Edward. Edward saw that they were not Henry VII's confidants, and had nothing to do with the incident of supporting Henry VII that year, so he let them go. According to the principle of, the predecessor does not like and is useless, I will reuse, he chose to accept these 10 nobles who were marginalized in the House of Lords. In addition, Edward retained Henry VII's Privy Council system to replace the Parliament that restricted the king. Of course, Edward had not yet decided who to appoint to the Privy Council. However, these were of little help in promoting the 3 Articles of the Law and establishing the prestige of the new king. So Edward asked Marin if there was any way to solve the problem so that the people would accept the new decree at once. Marin thought for a long time, and suddenly remembered brother Xiangyang who was torn to pieces by a chariot. There is a way, and it will work quickly. Tell me about it. Edward was very interested. In fact, neither Marin or Edward cared much about the specific content of the 3 Articles of the Law. What they cared about was how to use the law to legally kill Henry VII and his lackeys and eradicate them. After all, after the implementation of the 3 Articles of the Law, a new bill on sanctions against the regicide and his accomplices must be announced later. Therefore, this 3 Articles of the Law must be fired as the first shot. After that, we can enact a new law on how to deal with the regicide. Marin cleared his throat and said, "This method is called setting up a tree as a sign of trust. It is said that in China more than 1,850 years ago." Stop. Why are these stories from such a long time ago? At that time, ancient Rome had not yet occupied England. Edward said, somewhat collapsed. The ancient Chinese were so awesome. Marin said innocently. Okay, go on. A kingdom called Qin wanted to change the law, reform. Marin talked endlessly. Yes, that's the theme, and it's very similar to my current situation. Edward said happily. Xiangyang, who presided over the formulation of the new law, was afraid that the people would not believe in his new law, so he came up with an idea. He asked people to set up a 32-foot high wood outside the south gate of the capital market, and announced publicly that whoever could carry this wood to the north gate of the market would be rewarded with 10 taels of gold. Well, that's 13 ounces of gold. The south gate of the market to the north gate. Is it far? In addition, why is it in the market? Edward asked curiously. Not far, about a few hundred steps. The reason why it's in the market is that there are many people in the market, and word of mouth makes it more convenient to publicize the law. It makes sense. Only a few hundred steps, you can reward 13 ounces of gold, there are more than 100 gold coins, and I'm sure many people will rush to move it. Edward asked with great interest. No, Your Majesty, you are wrong. At the beginning, no common people were willing to try. Instead, they thought, isn't this crazy? Carrying a piece of wood for a few hundred steps and getting a reward of more than 100 gold coins is simply unbelievable. I also find it incredible when I heard it. Then what? Xiangyang raised the reward from 100 gold coins to 500 gold coins, but still no one came to try. Later, a commoner carried the wood with the mentality of giving it a try, and then, he really got a reward of 500 gold coins. This commoner got 500 gold coins at once, he really made a fortune. Edward said with emotion. Your Majesty, these are secondary. The important thing is that Xiangyang made people think through this incident that he is a man of his word. After that, no matter what he said or what decree he issued, everyone believed it. Edward thought about it, and then he suddenly realized. Then, he shouted happily. I also want to set up a tree as a sign of trust. Go and take down a pillar from the palace and move it to the market. Marin was stunned. If you want to set up a tree as a sign of trust, just do it. Why do you have to take down the pillar of the palace? Chapter 707 really gave gold coins. Seeing Marin's puzzled look, Edward said proudly. You don't understand this, right? You also said that the minister named Xiangyang set up an ordinary piece of wood and said he would reward hundreds of gold coins, but the people didn't believe it. And I took down a pillar of the palace and said that it was the pillar of the palace, which is much more credible. After all, it's something from the palace. Marin suddenly realized that this is the so-called aristocratic effect. In later generations, China's unscrupulous advertisements tried their best to be related to the court and the nobility. Like the mineral water from that mountain, it shamelessly claims to be the aristocrat in the water, and shamelessly makes up a love princess of a foreign princess. Marin sprayed directly after seeing it in his previous life. You, a local Chinese enterprise, have a relationship with a Western princess, is it really okay to make up like this? But, there are really fools who believe it. Just for the incongruous title of Water Noble, a group of country bumpkins were willing to buy it. So, it was a good idea for Edward to remove a pillar from the palace and use it as a letter wood. At least, the title of Palace Pillar is really intimidating. Soon, his soldiers removed a several-meter-long pillar from a small warehouse in the palace. It could only be such a small house. The main house was a stone fortress. Then, the soldiers carried it to a market near the palace. The market in the city of London is different from the Xianyang city of Qin. The market in ancient China was a market established by the government. It was an independent large area with a wall, with an independent courtyard and 4 gates, like a small city in the city, so there is a saying of the South Gate and the North Gate. The market in the city of London is a bit like the rural market in Marin's later life, which is set up along the bustling streets. Moreover, it is not far from the docks on the Thames. After all, London is an inland port with developed shipping and many goods imported from the docks. The streets near the South Gate Pier are most likely to form a market. So the soldiers carried the main beam removed from the palace to a main road near the South Gate that formed a market, intending to copy a tree erected as a sign of trust. In order to let the people of London know the news, Edward, at the suggestion of Marin, did not immediately start issuing rewards, but first sent people holding copper basins. In fact, ancient China used gongs to attract the attention of the people. But there were no gongs in ancient Europe, so Marin had to find a few copper basins and let the soldiers hold the copper basins in their left hands and the mallets in their right hands, and walk and knock as they went, replacing the copper gongs. They walked and knocked, walked through the streets and alleys, and loudly announced the tree erected as a sign of trust, for fear that someone would not know. Clang clang dash, the loud gong, oh no, it was the sound of the copper basins knocking, rang out in the streets and alleys of London, accompanied by the soldiers' shouts. His Majesty Edward has ordered that warriors who can carry wood will be recruited in the South Market. Anyone who can carry a wooden pillar removed from the palace from the east to the west of the South Market Street will be rewarded with 1,000 gold coins. A promise from the king is worth 1,000 gold coins. Any man who has the strength can try it. It will start at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Whoever is the first to carry the wooden pillar to the designated location will be rewarded with 1,000 gold coins. Edward knew the importance of the promulgation of the decree and its recognition by the people, so he was not stingy at all and directly raised the reward from Xiangyang's more than 500 gold coins to 1,000 gold coins to create the greatest sensation. The first day ended with the propaganda of the soldiers of the 4th Legion of Marin. In fact, many soldiers were very tempted and wanted to try. However, Edward would not let the soldiers participate. Because this was done for the citizens of London to see, it was naturally best for the citizens of London to carry the wood. The next morning, Edward and Marin, with a group of guards, came to the west end of the street in the South Market, waiting for the arrival of the warrior carrying the wood, and planned to be awarded a reward of 1,000 gold coins by Edward, the monarch himself. But after 9 o'clock, half an hour passed, and there were many onlookers, but not many people dared to come forward to carry the wood. In fact, Edward's move was very strange to the citizens of London. Because these 1,000 gold coins are too easy to earn. That's 1,000 gold coins, equivalent to 250 pounds. In this era, an ordinary British person only earned 2 or 3 pennies a day. 1 pound is equivalent to 240 pennies. Almost 250 pounds is equivalent to the income of an ordinary British person for 82 years, which is definitely a huge sum of money. Therefore, for such simple conditions and such generous reports, the people did not believe it and hesitated. Marin saw that this was not going to work, so he winked at Sakara. So, Sakara quickly arranged for the English soldiers of the 4th Legion to change into the clothes of ordinary people and mix in the crowd as a shill. Finally, under the encouragement of the shill arranged by Sakara, a strong and honest London youth stood up. Let me try. After that, the young man walked towards the legendary palace pillar with a nervous mood, carried it on his shoulders, and walked to the west of the street. The London citizens on the side immediately talked about it. Oh, isn't that John, the son of the old blacksmith Carl at the east end of the street? This young man is really stupid and bold, he is really a blacksmith. The money of the nobles is not so easy to take, maybe it's a trap. An old lady said. Seeing that the British aunt was going to divert the topic, the shill arranged by Marin immediately said. Who cares if it is a trap, won't you know when John the blacksmith finishes carrying it? Makes sense. People echoed one after another, and then stretched their necks to watch. The market street is not long, only about 500 meters long. So, John the blacksmith quickly carried the pillar to Edward. But when the young blacksmith named John approached, Marin reached out to the handle of the clockwork flint pistol at his waist. Because he was afraid that the young blacksmith named John would throw the heavy beam to hit him. Although the main beam is not big, it weighs hundreds of pounds. If it is hit, it will be injured if not killed. Fortunately, the young blacksmith John is not an assassin. After he carried the main beam to the west end of the street, he placed the main beam at the designated location under the guidance of the guards. Then, Edward walked over surrounded by the guards and said to John the blacksmith with a smile, "Good job, young man. What's your name?" "My name is John Carter." The young blacksmith answered honestly. Marin, who was standing aside, sprayed directly. "John, cattle?" In English, cattle means cow. The name of this blacksmith is so interesting, John Bull, so exciting. "Yes, sir, our family's surname is Nyo, and our ancestors were cattle herders. Later, I followed a baron and was given the surname of Cartel. However, that was hundreds of years ago. Now, the Cartel family has been in decline for a long time, and I can only make a living by blacksmithing." Marin was almost knocked down by the thunder, but Edward was not affected at all. "Okay, John, you are a brave boy, dare to try boldly. Don't worry, I will keep my word. So, your 1,000 gold coins, I will give it to you now." Edward was already very loud when he said the last part, actually he said it deliberately for the people around him to hear. After that, a guard came over with a small treasure chest. In front of everyone on the street, Edward opened the small treasure chest, and the inside immediately reflected a golden light. "It's really gold coins. So many." Some tall, long-necked Londoners exclaimed. Edward pushed the open treasure chest in front of John Carter and said gently, "You count it and see if there is anything wrong." John Carter was so stubborn that he actually started counting gold coins in the street. It was obvious that he didn't believe in King Edward. If it were any other time, Edward would have been angry. However, he was just trying to show that he was close to the people and trustworthy. So, Edward smiled and watched the honest John Bull count the gold coins. Fortunately, although John Bull had never been to elementary school, he had helped his father's blacksmith shop for a long time, so he often collected money and made changes, and he was good at math in the first grade. After a long time, John Carter finally raised his head, smiled and said, "Your Majesty, it is 1,000 gold coins." Then, he picked up the small treasure chest and turned away. Edward and Marin looked at each other in surprise. After receiving a generous reward of 1,000 gold coins, shouldn't he thank the king? In the end, Edward didn't care about John Bull's rudeness, because he came here to show his generosity and trustworthiness, and he couldn't care about such a small matter. On the contrary, he solemnly announced in public, "No one is allowed to take advantage of John Carter's bounty, otherwise, he will be severely punished." Soon, the news that the young blacksmith John Carter really received a reward of 1,000 gold coins after carrying the wood spread quickly throughout London and began to spread outside London. Of course, the English soldiers of the 4th Legion under Marin also contributed to it. What? Did they really give the gold coins? Yes, they really did. I saw it with my own eyes. John the blacksmith counted them in front of the new king. The golden light almost blinded my eyes. Ah! I hate it so much. If I had known earlier, I would have gone and let John, that big fool, take advantage of me. Someone beat his chest and stamped his feet and howled. Too late, the king has returned to the palace. Alas! 1,000 gold coins. You can't earn that in a lifetime. Yes, he actually gave it. The king is so generous. At this time, a young man on the side suddenly said, "Yes, King Edward is really a good king who keeps his word." In fact, this was released by Marin to lead the rhythm. After their efforts, Edward's tall image of keeping his word has been spread. Chapter 708 The Bloody Trial and the House of Commons. After several days, seeing that Edward's image of keeping his word and keeping his word began to gain popularity, Edward issued a new decree, 2 years of tax exemption for all of England. In fact, the promulgation of this decree was nothing big. After the Civil War, England's economy had suffered a heavy blow. Moreover, in this era, England did not have universal taxation, only 2 stable taxes, business tax and tariff. But because of the war, many business activities stopped, and England's import and export trade also came to a standstill. As for the church's tithe, it had nothing to do with the king. At least, it had nothing to do with the king before the Protestant Reformation and the confiscation of church property. In addition, the king of this era actually relied mainly on the harvest of the royal territory to maintain fiscal expenditures, and tax collection was actually only auxiliary and not very important. Therefore, Edward dared to announce a 2-year tax exemption at the suggestion of Marin. Moreover, this move is very conducive to the recovery of England's business. Because businessmen are profit-seeking animals. Hearing that there is a bargain, this group of people will definitely pounce on it like a shark smelling blood. When the 2-year deadline is up, those businessmen will not leave easily as long as they have stable profits and sufficient business channels. By then, the tax collected would be even higher. Although it had little to do with most people, Edward's announcement of tax exemption was well received by the people. In addition, with soldiers from the English Legion wearing makeup and mixing with the ordinary people, Edward's credibility and popularity among the people were even higher. It was not until a week later that Edward released another ultimate move, determining a new way to deal with the crime of regicide. In this announcement entitled Official Punishment Provisions for the Crime of Regicide, Edward clearly stipulated that the regicide, the whole family of the regicide. As for the followers of the regicide, those who directly participated in the regicide, the whole family will also be executed. As for those who followed the regicide afterwards, the person himself will be executed. At the same time, in this announcement, Edward clearly stated that although Richard III was suspected of regicide, Henry Tudor rashly rebelled and killed Richard III without finding conclusive evidence, which was undoubtedly the crime of regicide. And those who followed Henry VII to participate in the Battle of Bosworth were all accomplices who directly participated in the regicide. Those who later submitted to regicide Henry Tudor and supported him as king were guilty of treason, which was one level lower than regicide. Regicide was the highest level of criminal behavior, while treason was the second level. Regicide would kill the whole family, while treason would kill the person himself. After this regulation was issued, Edward first ordered the pardon of those ship owners of the Cinque Ports who had not sent people to help Henry VII guard London. Then, the public trial of Henry VII and his followers began in the square in front of the palace. Henry Tudor, a branch of the Beaufort family, has never had the right to inherit the throne. However, Henry Tudor was ambitious and disregarded the laws of the country. Without any proof that His Majesty Richard III had killed the king, he brazenly rebelled and killed His Majesty Richard III. This is a standard crime of regicide. Therefore, Henry Tudor's entire family is sentenced to death. But because Princess Elizabeth is a direct member of the York royal family. Therefore, Henry Tudor and his children are killed, and Princess Elizabeth, because she was forced to marry the traitor Henry Tudor, is pardoned and sent to the royal monastery for support. Edward invited an elder named William from the York family branch to pronounce the verdict in a rhythmic manner. He was a baron who originally followed Richard III and was later suppressed by Henry VII. Now, Edward specially asked the 60-year-old old man William to come out and serve as the Chief Justice. However, old man William was old, so it was inevitable that he could not raise his voice. So Edward simply found a few soldiers with loud voices to stand by, and they repeated loudly every sentence that old man William said. Then, the messenger nearby also opened his voice to spread it around. So, everyone in the square heard the verdict clearly. Margaret Beaufort and Thomas Stanley and his wife are the most important accomplices in the conspiracy to assassinate the king. The false King Henry Tudor was supported by this couple. At the same time, William Stanley's defection in front of the battlefield was one of the important reasons why Richard III was frightened and murdered. Therefore, in accordance with the purpose of the new law, this judge sentences the Stanley family to extermination, men, women, old and young, no one will be spared. His family in-laws must also hand over the women of the Stanley family and their descendants. Baron William pronounced the verdict with a serious face. Hiss, the whole verdict is too harsh. Many onlookers took a breath. It is normal for the men of the Stanley family to be executed. But married daughters will also be executed, and their children will be implicated. This is a bit disgusting and exaggerated. Knight Connor, who was in charge of leading the law, hesitated for a moment and asked. Your Majesty, how many generations can the women of the Stanley family go back? The Stanley family is too large. If the women of the previous generations are liquidated, too many nobles will be implicated. How many generations? Judge William was stunned, and then turned his eyes to Edward not far away. Edward thought for a while and said. Just implicate Thomas Stanley's sisters. As for the women of the Stanley family of the previous generation, they will not be investigated. Your Majesty, be merciful. Judge William flattered and conveyed Edward's meaning. Then, what about those members of the Stanley family who joined the church? Can we also arrest them? Knight Connor continued to ask. You know, the church is above the royal power. If you easily go to the church to arrest people, you will offend the Holy See. In particular, Edward has not yet been recognized by the Holy See. And Thomas Stanley's third son, James Stanley, happens to be a bishop, and his identity is very sensitive. William had to ask Edward for help again, and Edward also felt it was difficult at this time. Because he was also afraid that killing a protagonist would lead to a feud with the church, and then the throne would not be recognized by the church. But Marin, who was sitting next to him, gave him an encouraging look and said, Your Majesty, don't worry, just send troops to capture James Stanley, it's okay to kill him. Because I can help your Majesty mediate with the Pope. You help me mediate with the Pope? Edward was a little skeptical. Ahem, Your Majesty, before I negotiated to become the Grand Duke of the North Sea, the Pope personally came to help me. Otherwise, I would not have become the Grand Duke. Marin had to show his claws. At the same time, he was also complaining in his heart England is indeed a foreign land far away from the European continent, and it didn't even know such a big news. Is that so? Then. Can you help me make it clear to His Majesty the Pope and let the Church recognize the legitimacy of my throne? Edward said in surprise. Ahem, this is not impossible. I have asked the Pope before, asking Henry VII to find evidence to prove that Richard III killed the king, but he didn't find it, so he was at a disadvantage in legal terms. Yeah, I remember now, it's all thanks to you. So, what about getting the Holy See to recognize my throne? Your Majesty, if you want the Holy See to recognize your throne, it will probably cost a lot. Marin kept it a secret. In fact, he was sharpening his knife and wanted to kill Edward. Many nobles were executed in England this time, and there would be a lot of money to be made by copying those executed nobles. But Marin had been promised the Earl of Northumberland and the Isle of Wight, and he could no longer get his hands on those properties. It just so happened that Marin was going to take a share of the pie by taking this opportunity. In fact, it was just a matter of words to ask the Pope's father-in-law to help Edward clear his name. However, Edward didn't know that Julius II was his father-in-law. So, Marin decided to exaggerate the difficulty of the problem so that he could get more money from Edward. Okay, as long as the Holy See can recognize my throne as soon as possible, I am willing to offer a lot of property. With the recognition of the Holy See, he is the legitimate king. Edward thinks this deal is worth it. And Marin blackmailed Edward at this time, and Edward couldn't confirm it. Why? He couldn't go to Rome and ask the Pope, did Marin give you all the property? So Edward could only wait for the result. As for how much money Marin spent, he couldn't understand. But with Marin's guarantee, Edward ordered in high spirits. As long as it is within the scope of the sentence, the bishop will be arrested and killed. When saying this, Edward was domineering. My God, is His Majesty Edward going to go to war with the Holy See? Even the bishop dares to kill. But Edward didn't care. I have someone who can communicate with the Pope, what's this little thing? Of course, things are not calculated that way. Marin asked Edward to detain those prisoners who became bishops first. Then, look for evidence of their corruption. These days, the church is corrupt, and there are few bishops who are not corrupt. It is easy to find evidence, and there is no need to frame them. After finding the evidence, Marin would send someone to Rome to have Julius II announce the expulsion of these worms from the church. Then, Edward could order these people to be beheaded. However, Edward could not kill them before they were excommunicated. Otherwise, he would really break off relations with the church and go to war. Once excommunicated by the Pope, he might be abandoned by devout believers. The sentencing continued. John de Villers, Earl of Oxford, who had commanded the rebels for Henry VII in the Battle of Bosworth, was also sentenced to death with his family, including his daughter, son-in-law, and daughter's children. Rhys Apu Thomas, a Welsh noble who had strongly supported Henry VII and provided him with a landing site and military supplies, was also sentenced to death for his entire family. After half a day of sentencing, almost all the important figures who participated in the regicide war at the Battle of Bosworth were sentenced to death, and many of them were sentenced to death for their entire families. Among them was Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland. His whole family was sentenced to death, but only in this way could his territory be given to Marin. Then, there was a large group of nobles who were loyal to Henry VII afterwards. They were executed and their territories were deprived, including Howard, the Duke of Norfolk. Of course, it is said to be the Duke of Norfolk, but in fact, the Howard family's territory is in Arundel Castle in Sussex County, not Norfolk County. In fact, the title of Duke of Norfolk is more of a title, and the territory is far from a county. However, John Howard, the father of this generation of Duke of Norfolk, was once the commander of Richard III's army and died in the Battle of Bosworth. Therefore, in order to compensate the Howard family, Edward did not completely take back the Howard family's territory, but let Thomas Howard, the son of the current Duke of Norfolk, succeed to the throne, but his title was reduced to Earl of Arundel. As for the fiefdom, it is still around Arundel Castle, which is no different from before, but the title has been reduced by a large level. And this is also compensation for the fallen John Howard. Otherwise, the Howard family could be completely expelled. After a day of sentencing, thousands of nobles and their families were executed throughout England. It can be said that this was an unprecedented massacre of nobles in Europe. Every sentence of the verdict, from inside to outside, revealed blood and ruthlessness, which made people tremble with fear. Moreover, after this sentencing, the fiefs of those nobles, except for Northumberland County, which was granted to Marin, almost all fell into Edward's hands. The area of the manors left by these nobles alone was as large as several counties. In short, Edward basically made a fortune through the brutal act of killing all the great nobles. After the verdict, Edward gave a summary speech. "I am not a bloodthirsty person, but the regicide should be killed in the most cruel way. Otherwise, others will follow suit. This kind of punishment is only for the regicides who participated in the murder of the king. It is not aimed at any law-abiding citizens, nor does it apply to other crimes. Please rest assured. From today on, I will abide by the law with every citizen. As long as you abide by the law and do not break the law, I guarantee that you will not be harmed wantonly. Even nobles cannot easily deprive ordinary people of their lives. Anyone who breaks the law can be prosecuted. Except for the king and the crown prince who have judicial immunity, other people who commit crimes must be punished by law. Of course, even if the king commits a crime, he must pay a fine and admit his mistakes in public. Everyone is equal before God. And I, Edward, as the king, will follow the same law as any law-abiding citizen of the Kingdom of England." Then who should make the law? Suddenly, a young civilian in the square asked. In fact, this is a stooge arranged by Marin. Good question, citizen. I have decided that the laws will be jointly decided by the 4 classes of the whole society in the future. These 4 classes are the king, the church, the members of the House of Lords, and the members of the House of Commons. I have decided to rename the House of Lords of Parliament as the House of Upper Parliament, and the House of Commons as the House of Commons. The formulation of laws will be discussed by the king, the church, the nobles, and the representatives of the common people. These are all discussed by Edward and Marin. How are the members of the House of Commons elected? The young man continued to ask. In fact, this is also the key point of the key point. According to convention, the members of the House of Commons should be elected by the people. However, these members elected by the people often oppose the king everywhere. Therefore, Marin helped Edward think of a way to get a neck in academic qualifications. In other words, if you want to become a member of parliament, you must have a university degree. This neck-locking method is very hidden. Because most civilians can't afford to go to college at all. And many fighters who are good at fighting in the House of Commons may not have a high degree. People with high education often read too many books and become a little dull, which is what ordinary people call nerds. If these nerds are allowed to enter the House of Commons, then their fighting power will be several levels lower than those quarrel masters who have climbed up from the grassroots, and they will be much easier to deal with. As for those grassroots quarrel masters who are dissatisfied, it's easy to deal with it. You can't even read books well. What qualifications do you have to talk about national politics? But people who read too well often fall into the ocean of knowledge and may not care about worldly affairs. At that time, as long as the king provides them with a good academic research environment, who would quarrel with the king? Facing the young man's question, Edward explained calmly. I plan to build a New England University of Law and Political Science and recruit students from all over the country. Except for the children of criminals, people from all walks of life can sign up. As long as you are willing to be loyal to the king and serve the whole of England, you can apply for this university. The university recruits a large number of civilians and only looks at test scores, not recommendations. Whoever scores high will be hired. Whoever has good grades is more qualified to become a member of the House of Commons. The young man looked silly and said, "Then what about those of us who are not good at studying? You can't even study well, and you still want to be a member of Parliament? What if the level of the members of Parliament is too poor and they govern England badly? You know, governing a country requires a very high level of cultural knowledge." Edward said speechlessly. Suddenly, many people around laughed. In fact, these people who laughed were also shills. Edward's speech was flawless and quite reasonable. But in fact, the biggest loophole in this speech is that in this era, how many children of ordinary people have the opportunity to go to college? In the end, aren't those children from rich families going to college? Moreover, Marin's advice to Edward is that when selecting graduates of the School of Political Science and Law to enter official institutions in the future, specifically select those obedient nerds. And those who jump out, especially those who oppose the king, will be suppressed secretly, and even find opportunities to use the school rules formulated by the king to expel them and prevent them from graduating. Without a degree, they will not be qualified to participate in politics. In this way, the House of Commons is full of obedient nerds. Who is going to compete with the king? However, few ordinary people in this era have read books. Who can see the trap? On the contrary, in their view, using educated civilians to participate in politics is a very responsible approach. Moreover, Edward also said that civilians can take the university entrance examination, regardless of status and recommendation, only the test scores are considered. Look, how fair it is. As for those masters of speech who jump out of the ordinary, you should just be at ease as your village councillor. As for running for the House of Commons, get out, poor students are not allowed to enter. If you don't become a nerd and don't support the king, you are not allowed to enter the House of Commons. When the system is implemented for a long time, a class of scholars will appear in the whole of Britain. This class is similar to the class of scholars in the Ming dynasty. They obtain academic qualifications through reading and get the opportunity to enter official work. As vested interests, they will control the government, support the royal family that proposes academic qualifications, and jointly suppress those grassroots fighters who are very combative, and automatically maintain social order. Of course, they are not Confucian scholars, do not have a complete set of doctrines, and cannot form their own school. Marin proposed to Edward, hang the king's head portrait in front of the classroom of the London University of Political Science and Law, and let the students ask for instructions in the morning and report in the evening to the king's head portrait every day, and brainwash those students into the king's diehards. In the end, these people will become the king's diehards. In the House of Commons, these people will not only not fight against the king, but will become the king's helpers. Chapter 709 Royal University of Political Science and Law. Marin had the idea of establishing a political and legal university a long time ago. However, East Frisia, including the current Grand Duchy of the North Sea, lacks scholars and young students of the right age. Therefore, it was delayed. You know, the compulsory education that Marin carried out a few years ago, most of those children and teenagers have not yet completed their primary school courses, and only a small number of smart children have started to study. Marin's plan is to open a formal university and train them well after this small number of children have finished the relatively difficult junior high school courses. What? You said that the junior high school level is not enough to go to university. Please, that is the standard of later generations. In this era at the beginning of the 16th century, the level of junior high school graduates was definitely considered a top student and was fully qualified to go to university. Of course, Marin has now opened a University of Auric. However, the students recruited are mainly for the children of domestic nobles and the children of civilians from some other states. However, Marin did not have much hope for those noble children, but just let them gild. What Marin really values are mainly those young civilian students from other states. In order to win over these people, Marin set up a large number of scholarships and provided work arrangements after graduation to attract them to work for him. The main courses offered by the University of Auric now include theology, law, economics, medicine and natural sciences. The training of grassroots officials mainly relies on law and economics. However, Marin has always believed that this seems to be a bit lacking. Because students of the law department are more suitable to be a judge or lawyer. And students of economics are more suitable to be a financial officer. This is because the current level of economics is low, more like accounting in later generations, rather than economics. Therefore, Marin's idea is to establish a special political and legal university, including the two courses of law and economics. At the same time, add political courses, blend the two disciplines of law and economics together, so that graduates become comprehensive talents who are proficient in law and understand economics. As for the content of political courses, it is naturally not the high-end doctrine of Marxist bearded man learned in later universities. To be honest, although Marin also studied courses such as Marxist philosophy and Marxist political economy in college in later generations, it was not suitable for the university that Marin wanted to open. In the final analysis, it is also a question of what goes around comes around. The doctrine of the bearded man is against the monarchy, and Marin is precisely a feudal monarch. Is he trying to kill himself by introducing the doctrine of the bearded man? Therefore, Marin feels that Taylor's brainwashing stuff is more suitable for the needs of this era. Taylor's brainwashing politics of loyalty to the king, combined with existing legal and economic theories, to establish a professional political and legal university has always been Marin's grand vision. In Marin's plan, this political and legal university will train grassroots and senior officials across the country in the future. Without a degree from this political and legal university, you will not be appointed. No matter where you are, as long as you are not a noble, you must take out a diploma from the political and legal university before you can be appointed as an official. Otherwise, get out. In other words, except for the children of nobles, civilians who want to be officials must have a diploma from the political and legal university. Otherwise, admission is refused. And those who want to obtain a diploma from the University of Political Science and Law must not only have excellent academic performance, but their counselors will also track and observe their ideological dynamics. Any student who opposes the monarch will not be allowed to graduate and will not be given a diploma. In this way, the possibility of students who oppose the monarch becoming officials is eliminated. Although, this cannot rule out some people who hide their true thoughts very deeply and get a diploma. However, such people are a minority after all. Once the number is small, it will not be a climate. All of the above were originally Marin's own plans. However, considering that he will enter England in the future, it just so happens that after this massacre of nobles, there is an extreme shortage of officials in England. Therefore, Marin simply let Edward try to do this kind of political and legal university first. When Edward makes a name for himself, he can almost control England, just picking peaches. Moreover, in the process of establishing a special political and legal university, Marin will participate in the whole process and send Big Liar Taylor and others to help with the construction. In this way, Marin can fully understand the various difficulties in the initial construction of the University of Political Science and Law and overcome them. Then, these experiences will become an important reference for Marin to build a full-time political and legal university. Edward was very interested in Marin's suggestion to establish a full-time political and legal university. In particular, Marin proposed that the students of the political and legal university should ask for instructions in the morning and report in the evening to his portrait every day, which made him secretly happy. To this end, Edward planned to quickly transfer scholars of law and economics close to the York family from Oxford University and Cambridge University, together with Taylor and others who were supported by Marin, to establish a professional political and legal university in London. As for the name of the university, Edward designated it as the Royal University of Law and Political Science in England. As for the school site, it was directly set in the western suburbs of London, approximately the area of Westminster in later generations. In addition, according to Marin's suggestion, Edward would serve as the first president of the Royal University of Law and Political Science in England. Of course, a deputy president would be set up to be in charge of school affairs. After all, Edward was still a king and had no time to manage the school. Except for the opening ceremony and graduation ceremony, the deputy president would definitely manage the school at other times. And the title of executive vice president is also very Chinese. With the title of principal, those graduates can regard themselves as king's disciples in the future. At the same time, they inevitably stand on Edward's side. And this trick was learned by Marin and Jiang Guangtou, and it seems to be very useful. If one day you want to win over an outstanding student, you can also play like this. Okay, XX, don't call me your majesty, just call me the principal in private. Listen, how tender. A monarch said this, don't you give all your loyalty? Otherwise, are you worthy of the great principal's appreciation of you? Of course, these are purely Marin's YY. At the same time, it is indeed Marin's plan. Marin plans to start preparing for the separate establishment of the University of Political Science and Law and the Military Academy after returning to China. Marin may not care too much about other schools, but the University of Political Science and Law is a place to train national officials. And the Military Academy is the cradle for training officers. Marin must serve as the principal of these two universities. By then, all officials in the country will be his students, and all officers in the army will also be his students. In this way, why worry about the instability of the country? Ma Lin has already imagined a picture. The middle-aged bald Ma Lin, wearing a military uniform, came to the conference room. Suddenly, everyone in the conference room stood up and shouted in unison, "Hello, Principal." Then, Ma Lin waved his hand calmly and said, "Fuck it, everyone sit down." Hey, why did he have to say, "fuck it"? Isn't this the line of Jiang Guangtou? Ma Lin touched his head. It seems that he is not bald yet. Chapter 710, The Will and the Bloody Crown. On the second day of the trial, most of the convicted nobles of Henry VII's faction, including their families, were taken to the execution ground. The execution ground was set up in the square at the southwest gate of the Tower of London. On that day, it was crowded with people. The people of London came to watch the grand scene of the beheading of the former king and the former nobles. With an order, the executioners swung their axes and chopped the necks of Henry VII and others fiercely. For a time, blood splattered. The beheading of men such as Henry VII and Thomas Stanley was not bad, they were all silent. But the beheading of women and children was very distressing. When the women and children were pressed on the guillotine, they kept crying and begging for mercy. Even the cruel Marin saw it and couldn't bear it. Even Edward, who gave the order, couldn't help closing his eyes. But both of them knew the truth that, if you don't cut the grass by the roots, it will grow again in the spring breeze. Back then, wasn't it because Henry VII was alive that Henry VII was able to raise the banner against Richard III? If Henry VII had been killed when he was still a child, then there wouldn't have been so many troubles. After all, bloodline was very important in ancient Europe. Without royal bloodline and noble bloodline, no one would pay attention to what you said. Even if you raise your arms and shout, you will only be regarded as a lunatic. On this day, the blood of thousands of men, women, and children who were killed in the square outside the southwest gate of the Tower of London gathered into a pool of blood. On the same night, Henry VII's Queen Elizabeth hanged herself in the convent where she was under house arrest. Before committing suicide, Queen Elizabeth left a blood letter. "Edward, I'm waiting for you in hell. My children and I will tear your soul apart." Seeing this resentful blood letter, Edward was stunned for a long time, sitting on the throne for a long time without moving, and kept muttering to himself. "Am I wrong? Am I wrong?" "No, Your Majesty, you are not wrong," Marin said firmly. Edward still had to clean up the mess in England, and he didn't want to see Edward depressed. "But my cousin's resentment towards me was so deep before she died. Edward almost cried. Marin quickly said seriously. "No, Your Majesty, if your sister Margaret and I hadn't found a way to replace you from the Tower of London, you would have been beheaded in the winter of 1497. And those people you ordered to be killed yesterday, they would have ignored your blood and drank heartily. The fight for the throne must be extremely bloody. The winner is the king, and the loser is the enemy. The winner is the king, and the loser is the enemy." Edward repeated Marin's words, and finally came to his senses. "Yes, Your Majesty, this is a common saying in the Eastern Empire. It means that history is written by successful people. Your Majesty, you succeeded, so, in the history books, Henry VII and others will be infamous for all eternity, but you will be glorious for all eternity." Edward thought for a long time, nodded, and said, "I understand, but, this blood letter, my reputation." Marin's eyes flashed with ferocity, and he said, "Tear it up, and imitate this handwriting to write a suicide note with the opposite meaning. Use the tone of Princess Elizabeth to say that she was forced to marry Henry VII. And her children were all illegitimate children that Henry VII forced her to give birth to, and they deserved to die. As for the reason why Princess Elizabeth committed suicide, just say that she gave birth to a child for her enemy and was ashamed of the ancestors of the York family." Edward was shocked. Are you going to forge a suicide note? But, has anyone else known about this? How many people know about this? It hasn't spread out, right? Probably a few nuns in the monastery, and a few guards who went to deal with the matter. Very good, deal with them secretly. As for the fake suicide note, I'll do it. After saying that, Marin once again used the skill of imitating handwriting that he had learned from the buddy who gave false testimony in his previous life, and began to write a fake suicide note by imitating Queen Elizabeth's handwriting with the blood that he sent someone to get from the square. An hour later, Edward took the two real and fake suicide notes, looked left and right, and was shocked. This. Don't be surprised, Your Majesty, this is just a little trick. Marin said lightly. Edward thought about it and tore the real suicide note into pieces. On the third day, Edward invited the citizens of London and representatives of foreign chambers of commerce to attend his coronation ceremony. Because he could not find foreign envoys to watch the ceremony, Edward simply invited the members of the investigation team sent by the Vatican to investigate whether Edward V was murdered, who had not yet left London, to attend the coronation ceremony as foreign guests. In this investigation team sent by the Pope, there were French and Scottish people. They were half threatened by Marin's men and attended the bloody coronation ceremony as foreign guests. The starting point of the coronation ceremony was still in the large square outside the southwest gate of the Tower of London, where thousands of nobles were killed yesterday. Although all the bodies and blood in the square had been cleared away by the efforts of the civilians, the air was still filled with an extremely strong smell of blood. In order to cover up this smell and prevent the spread of plague, Marin had people sprinkle a lot of quicklime on the square. However, it still couldn't cover up the bloody smell. But Edward himself didn't care, even the blood on the crown taken from the head of the murdered Henry VII, he didn't even wipe it, and thought it was unnecessary. The regicide will eventually be punished by God, and it is God's arrangement that I can survive and kill all those regicides. Edward shouted loudly on the high platform, holding the golden scepter. They deserve to die. And I, according to God's arrangement, will become the king of all England and Ireland. Edward looked at the guillotine in the center of the square with contempt, and then shouted confidently. Long live the king! Marin took the opportunity to lead his English soldiers to lead the rhythm. Long live the king! This was the arranged civilians shouting. Long live the king! The people of London were finally brought into the rhythm. Amid the cheers of the people, Edward held his wife Anna's hand, set out from the square, boarded the carriage, and went to Westminster Abbey under the escort of Marin's tens of thousands of troops, where the blood-stained crown was placed on his head by the frightened Archbishop of Canterbury William Warham. Then, Edward took a queen's crown from William Warham and put it on his wife Anna. In fact, William Warham was an archbishop who was fostered by Henry VII, and was not on Edward's side at all. Even William Warham himself was unwilling to crown Edward. Originally, William Warham wanted to use the authority of the church to reject Edward. Because he didn't think Edward dared to go against the church. However, Marin didn't give him any face at all. Marin tied up all of William Warham's relatives and brought them to William Warham, threatening. Either help His Majesty Edward to be crowned, or you and your entire family will die. Faced with Marin's almost open death threat, William Warham was shocked and angry. How dare you? I am the Archbishop of the Holy See. Aren't you afraid of the punishment of the Pope? Pope. Ahahaha. I will kill your whole family, and the Pope will not punish me. Marin said arrogantly. And just beside him, Pastor Roney, a representative of the investigation team sent by the Holy See, pretended not to see it, raised his head, and began to carefully observe the dome structure of the church. Mr. Envoy, this man is disrespectful to the Holy See, don't you care? William Wallam asked the Holy See delegation for help. However, Pastor Roney directly said. I didn't see anything, and I didn't hear anything. Pastor Roney was a close subordinate of Julius II, and naturally knew the close relationship between Marin and Julius II. Therefore, for Marin's threat to kill the entire family of the Archbishop of Canterbury, he directly chose to pretend not to see it. Seeing that even the Holy See envoys didn't care about Marin's barbaric behavior, Archbishop of Canterbury William Wallam had to give in. So, when Edward was wearing the bloody crown, he was still trembling, and had not yet recovered from the shock. After wearing the bloody crown, Marin quickly presented the king's sword that he had found in Henry VII's palace. Edward handed the golden scepter to Queen Anna, and raised the king's sword himself, saying loudly, England's blood has dried up, and the true king has returned. England's glorious era has arrived. Long live! Long live! Long live! Tens of thousands of soldiers shouted in unison inside and outside the church. Because they had rehearsed in advance, and Marin's military discipline was already good, the sound of tens of thousands of people shouting in unison resounded throughout the city of London, shocking all the spectators, whether they were London citizens or foreign guests.